Hey there guys, Spazzy Dragon here, aka Syndromes, and welcome to this little questions and answers video. Now, as I already expected for this to happen, but there's not a lot of comments, not a lot of questions, but at the same time it's probably for the best because that means that I can kind of sit here, relax during my Saturday evening, respond to them in detail, and make things interesting. And so, without further ado, we're gonna start off with the question from Felix Tuchinski, who is the first one to comment on that video, and whose question I at first thought was a meme or a joke, so kudos for you to actually make me Google this stuff. So, the question is, what do you think about Neuralink as a response to the upcoming Singularity? And I'm not going to go into full detail of what they both mean, even though I did read the Wikipedia articles on both topics, but what first seemed like a joke comment, it kicks off this sort of mental gymnastics and kind of, what will happen if sort of thing. But my overall opinion about this sort of thing and my answer to your question would be that I'm fully aware that right now, living in 2019... So, first of all, both of these topics are far away for me to not know anything about them. Like, I really doubt it's going to happen in my lifetime. It's probably going to be the next generation, or the one after the next generation. But I'm fully aware that if I was to start speculating about these topics, it would be very similar to what we have that one video of this small British kid and his, 12-year-old or 13-year-old, where he talks about the future in the 1950s or 1960s. It's a very interesting video as from the perspective of how a human would imagine future technological achievements from the concept of what they currently have. And so that is going to be my response to you, because I'm fully aware that I'm currently viewing this from the same standpoint as that kid in the 1950s, and that these sort of technologies would require a vastly different human culture, or, to be more precise, a vastly different, societal structure and perception of technology. So, as someone living in the 2019s, I currently lack some of these essential building blocks that would be a part of this sort of society, meaning I cannot even fully comprehend the idea of this being a part of my life. I can imagine it, but I know that I'm inherently wrong because I lack some of the context that I would otherwise have. And so, that's going to be your... that's what I think about Neuralink as a response to the upcoming technological singularity. So, yeah. Now then, our second question comes from Freelancer Warzone, and before I answer it, I just have to say, this dude is pretty much responsible for this video, because he basically came in, saw there's no comments, and just started asking questions. So he is the reason why this video is responsible, and all of the questions that he asks are actually fun to answer. So let's get into it. Quote, I remember a question from the Disco talk show that went something like this. What would save Disco from damnation? But my question is, what do you think Freelancer needs or lacks that would otherwise reignite the interest in the game? Obviously, we are talking about a game that is way past its prime, but a small group of people are still no doubt interested in it, but they did most what mods can offer, tried out everything, and they're probably explore-traveled enough in-game for it to become a chore rather than fun. And this goes back to my previous video response to the topic of advertising Freelancer, in that you are completely right. The people who enjoyed Freelancer as a game, they have gotten everything out of it that can be mechanically soundly implemented with the people that we currently have working on the mod. It's not that they're not trying, it's just that there's just a sort of limitation that exists for a software so old. And so I think that what will save Disco from damnation is that if we start thinking about, again, advertising Disco less of a game, but more as the community itself, because there's tons of people who are interested in the very concept of a ongoing, perpetual D&D in space experience where you don't need to plan like in regular tabletop encounters, where you don't need to plan with friends or to get together. You can just hop on and any day you want, find interaction, find roleplay, and have fun. Because again, Disco has a very good setting, and it offers for these people a lot of ways to flex their feet, so to speak. So, but the problem that we are currently seeing here is that we need to make these people aware of Freelancer, that it exists. Like, Disco is this constant, ongoing Disco Dungeons and Dragons session in space, right? So, I would say probably need to advertise more on online roleplay sites, but frankly, I think that currently with the fact that, again, GTA 5 roleplay servers are becoming very popular now, and San Andreas servers, especially in Russia, are still very popular, much more so, and they survived much longer than Freelancer did. Let's give them that. I think that what Disco currently lacks is a group of highly active content makers in terms of video, in terms of streaming on Twitch or any other platforms, that would be basically a huge billboard. Because going back to 2008 and 2009 and 2010, I was pumping out Freelancer content like crazy, and I would be attracting these people. Like, I wasn't even trying to advertise Disco. I just made the content for the sake of making it, uploading it into my channel, and just watching the view count rise. It was fun, right? I wasn't strictly thinking about advertising Disco, so if someone is out here in Discovery Freelancer who just wants to kind of do their streams, kind of do their videos, if you keep them coming, if you seem to have fun while doing so, people will check it out, just to see how good it is. So that would be my what would save Disco from damnation. New players, obviously. Players are content, so that is the obvious what would save Disco from damnation. The idea that I'm kind of hesitant to say is that we kind of need new players to replace the old blood that stagnate Disco. Now, I'm not going to point any fingers, and they themselves know very well that they are just grown into moss at this point. But yeah, I think that Outside's perspective of Disco is basically that we are a community with a very strong, very old, and very dedicated core. Yeah, dedicated. But it's not currently helping Disco kind of survive, if that makes any sense. So that's that question. Okay, next question. What do you think is Freelancer's greatest strength and worst aspect? Gameplay-wise, asset-wise, etc. I have mentioned this before, but I think that one of the greatest strengths of Freelancer as a game, and especially what makes it so good as a roleplay platform, like why did our server evolve on Freelancer and didn't migrate over time to some other, other game that can be modded like that. And its first greatest strength is its modability and simplicity, which in the long term might not be giving us many favors because we are still limited to a very archaic, very old game. And let's face it, FL Hook is basically just strings, duct tape, and spit barely held together for it to work. And while it still works, it's fine, but it's kind of obvious that we are starting to hit that ceiling. And this is something that has been said like since 2013, that it's like, hey, we are butting heads against that ceiling, and we need to kind of evolve. So I guess that is its biggest weakness as well as its biggest strength, but in terms of setting and in terms of gameplay-wise, there's one very interesting thing and what makes Disco 4 an amazing roleplay platform specifically. And that is the idea that the guys at Digital Anvil, they had to construct a universe and then populate it with believable characters, settings, scenes, factions, the houses they made, everything else. It was a huge amount of work, but obviously work, especially in game development, is finite, and so they had to stop somewhere. They fleshed out the world of Freelancer to the point where we have information of many things, but much of it is kept vague, or they have left holes either by necessity or by design, where a individual player can sort of use their own imagination to fill in the blanks. And that is an amazing thing to have for a game that is then used as a roleplay platform, because it encourages information, it encourages speculation, imagination, writing of stories, writing of your sort of thoughts about this topic or that topic. It encourages diversity because one player can view one faction as one thing and the other player is like, no, if you look at from this way, like it encourages multiple sort of views on the same topic, and I think that is just crucial for a roleplay platform. Like, if we ever move away from Freelancer, if we ever migrate to another game, it has to have these flaws. Solid base, but enough holes in it that it can then be filled by player roleplay. Because if everything is written in stone and it's just canon lore, then it's not as fun anymore. And I think that is, and still remains, the biggest strength of Freelancer as a setting, as a game, and as a roleplay platform. And next one. Other than the various character-based playthroughs in Avorion along with their strict playstyle, how else would you keep yourself entertained by it? I put in exactly 100 hours after I got hyped up by a first playthrough, but sadly only played 4 more hours since then, and I haven't found a good reason or excuse to go in there and do something. So yeah, I'm currently having the same issue, which is why I started doing the various character-based playthroughs in Avorion, because the core gameplay is amazing in that game. The mechanics of how you build your ships and how their many requirements require you to add multiple features, multiple types of blocks, and everything else. I think they have the core down perfect. But I'm currently looking forward to the fact that they not only introduced mods, and we're talking about Steam Workshop mods, but they are also currently working very closely with the existing modders. Like, I'm in the Discord right now, I can see the modding section of the Avorion Discord, and it's just lines and lines of code and modders and developers just talking between themselves as to what features they need to add, what kind of functionality they need to add to the game to make this game much more moddable. And I think that Avorion, once it comes out, like once Avorion 1.0 comes out, it is going to be made in a way that is moddable and let the community just take over. Because modders are always going to have more time and more, you know, inclination apart from monetary and treating it as a job to add more things to the game that have the potential to fail. Developers need to add assets and systems to a game, and they cannot waste their time on something that can fail. But obviously modders, since they're doing it for free and out of just the love for the game, they can experiment. They have the chance to fail, or something doesn't work. It's okay, just, you know, into the bin, try something else. And that is what going to... Again, just like in Dwarf Fortress, just like in RimWorld, these games survive off modders, and I think that they are aware, the devs are aware of that, and they're making the game as easy to mod as possible within reason. Overall, something that I'm looking forward is, from a, ground up suggestion, is that I'm pretty sure that they need to put the procedural, the fact that the focus on procedural generation in the background, because the moment they apply lore and a storyline to the game, they already have put it out as a complete sandbox. You still have a progression, you still have a story you follow. That needs to be the case. And I think that they need to dial down the focus on procedural generation a little bit more, and instead focus on fleshing out the world itself, perhaps even to the point where they introduce some sort of houses like in Freelancer that, upon the generation of the galaxy, can have varying degrees of influence and overall military power and presence in the galaxy. Like, for example, we have... So what I'm saying is that the specifics of the galaxy are procedurally generated, but the content that you find in that galaxy is already pretty much set in stone. You have these sorts of turrets, you have these sorts of zones and everything else. Why not just roll with that? Abandon the focus on procedural generation and instead do something like Mountain Blade Warband, where you have, the factions make war and make truce. They capture existing cities, and, in this case it would be sectors, and they get them back. They raid, they pillage, they loot, they trade between one another. This sort of complexity is complex, and it's going to require a huge amount of effort, but if they pull this off, if they actually make a Avorian, which is basically just Mountain Blade Warband in space, I guaranteed you I would be playing the shit out of it. Posimus friends. But yeah, apart from that, perhaps taking some sort of pointers from other games such as Dwarf Fortress with their pre-generated worlds. Obviously, being a non-text ASCII key-based game, Avorion cannot go to that sort of depth in terms of how the history of the universe is generated. But again, if they want to actually focus on the generation itself, like on the generator itself, then perhaps making it something lean towards like Dwarf Fortress in general could be an option, but again, it's up to devs. In general, my answer is I'm looking forward for the game to come out, for the mods to come in, and then I think I will be able to easily revisit it every couple of months when I get bored, and it's going to be one of those games that I play every once in a while, and I'm looking forward for it. So the next one's actually pretty humorous for me. How much do you know about modding Freelancer Plus and server plugins? And the answer is nothing at all. Nothing at all. So the only thing that I have going for me in terms of Freelancer modding and server management is that if you give me the full documentation of how something works, I usually am curious enough to try it, to take it apart at some point after I get very used to using it. Like, my best example for it is back when I became staff because I wanted to do events, because, again, that's the reason why I became staff. I wanted to be a event manager, even though the title didn't exist. I had to become a administrator for that. And once I became admin, I ended up actually having to be an admin, and, well, I think people can agree that I wasn't a very good admin, because, again, I wanted to just do events, but, that's not really a choice. But that's a completely different topic. If you want, I can talk about it in length at some point. But the idea is that if you give me the tools, and if you give me means to kind of understand what these tools do, I can figure it out, and I can start tinkering with things. So, I mean, remember that one event in Delta where the first NEMP was launched? yeah, that was basically me just using tools that were usually used to create bases. For example, I used to create bases that would have goods inside them, and people would have to lock them down, move the goods, and, you know, interact with each other. That's all fine and dandy, but then came the realization that I can spawn effects in, and that was like something amazing. And one of the more grandiose effects that I had at the time was the Nomad Reactor one. It's like, holy shit, this looks like a nuclear explosion, like a nova in space. Like, how do I do that? And when the people in that Delta event gave me a reason, an excuse to kind of cut the event short because of some stupidity that they did out of roleplay, I nuked them, and it was an amazing sight. So, again, I don't know anything about coding. I can pull apart some sort of... I can open up existing weapons in Freelancer, I can figure out how to do effects, I can figure out how to change priorities, but if you gave me some sort of goal, I don't think I would be able to achieve it because I lack the necessary information. I can modify a lot of things, I can tinker with them, see what works, see what doesn't work, but if you'd ask me to do something from scratch, then it doesn't exist. All of the event-related plugins like displaying text when you enter a contested territory, the Titan thing, all of those plugins were made either by pestering Ali or pestering Laz, or Alex. Actually, no, I don't think I've ever pestered Laz, but I think I did pester Alex a lot. And all of the NPCs, I had to pester Xelrock. Like, these people are the ones who actually make the content, and I've never really, you know, said they weren't. I always specifically thank the people who made these mods, these plugins, or these NPCs, or these loadouts possible, but that's basically my answer. How much do I know about modding? Enough to tinker with it, never to create with it. I can usually figure out how to make them, how to use these things in interesting ways, but that's basically it. Okay, and the next one. Knowing you're not native English, but hearing how good you are actually at speaking it, how did you develop these skills, and what would you say was the greatest contributor to it? So, I'm going to just straight up piss people off by saying that when you're a kid, you tend to learn languages in general better than when you're an adult, and some kids were just basically better at it. It's not a talent, it's just something in your brain where you can just process information when it comes to spoken and written whatever languages better. And I was good enough that I could learn English, I could learn Russian, and it really helped. But I guess one of the more driving factors to it, like having talent is one thing, and being able to learn requires a teacher, and it was in my preschool days where we had this one optional sort of English crash course lesson thing for, you know, pre-grade schoolers, and it was amazingly fun. Like, it was hosted by the school's director, and she was a amazing woman in terms of she was very strict, but she could teach. Like, she was the director, she wasn't usually involved in teaching, she didn't teach any particular, you know, thing apart from these secondary sort of, you know, secondary things. But yeah, she made learning English fun, and she was the first part. The second part was the introduction of cable television, where we suddenly got things like Cartoon Network. And since I was a kid, I really liked watching cartoons, and the more I watched, and I slowly picked it up. The third thing, and I know this might kind of sound strange, but since I was left alone a lot, I used to talk to myself in non-native languages as if I was on a talk show, and it really helped. And overall, that is sort of the thing. If you live alone, if you have the privacy for it, have those... like, people would say, oh, you have these, you know, some people talk to themselves in the shower. It helps. If you do that in a completely different language to your own, and just pick a topic, and just start talking to yourself, give your opinion, give your arguments, give stuff. If you missay something, simply wind it back. It's like, you know, it's basically how it happens. And to be fair, I'm pretty sure that I used to know English pretty well, like looking at my very old videos. But at the same time, I don't think I had this voice, and this voice didn't really come from just talking on TeamSpeak. I just talk to myself when I'm home, when I'm bored, or when I'm practicing for a video like this. And maybe one day you are going to have the same voice. Maybe. Alright, next one. What is that one minor thing that Discovery always lacked, but would have been drastically changed how it would have been played? Honestly, where to start? Randomized equipment statistics within a certain frame, crafting of in-game items, which would have gone pretty interesting, you know, together with that thing. Permadeath of ships and equipment, for example. If you just lost the ship and not the equipment, you would have to rebuild it or something. It'd make the ships a lot cheaper, but at the same time, you know, salty people are already salty, so again, that would have been a game changer, and I really doubt that it would have been a, you know, a good game changer. Honestly, there's just a lot of things that Disco currently lacks that would change it, but the details always, or rather, the devil is always in the details, so if you change something drastically, well, it wouldn't have been really Disco at that point, would it? I think that one of the more drastic things that I always wanted to happen is that the overall feel and separation between capital ships and snubs could have been done by making capital ships much faster, but also way slower to turn, to maneuver, pitch up, pitch down, turn left, turn right, whatever. To gain speed and to lose speed would have been a very, very slow, but their maximum cruising distance, not even cruising, like remove cruise engines and just give them regular, you know, movement, that would have been around 500. Make their guns shoot so slowly so that if you're actually sitting inside of a snub fight, there's nothing you can do to any snubs. If you're sitting still, bombers can get you, but you can just away if a bomber tries to shoot you because you're going 500. But at the same time, shooting from this speed would actually give the shots, would give the projectiles the velocity they need, and then jousting capital ship fights would actually be a thing. And obviously huge problems with this idea, but I think it would be amusing if you know, nothing else. But basically that. Honestly, there's a lot of things that Discovery lacks, you know, apart from new players, but drastic changes in how it's played is probably not something you want to do right now, especially when we were trying to get new players. Drastic changes in general, no one finds them amusing. It's interesting until it becomes very tedious to relearn everything else, and because, again, many of the current players tend to think that, you know, their values that they know in Disco inside out, perhaps in more ways than just one. But yeah, that's basically my thoughts about that. One minor thing. Minor. I guess the keyword is minor. A minor thing that drastically changes how it would have been played. Honestly, I would say include the original game's ISO file inside the launcher so many players can just test it out without having to hunt down the ISO through sketchy pages. I think that would have been an interesting thing. That would have been a minor thing that would have drastically changed how it's marketed to new players anyway. But yeah, my 2 cents. And now, here comes some of the more tricky things. For example, what keeps you motivated? And yeah, good question. So, this is obviously not a surprise to anyone, but I don't view my YouTube channel as anything of very huge significance, and I certainly don't think that I'm doing the whole YouTube thing as periodically or as frequently as some of the other YouTubers, or as most YouTubers who actually do treat their YouTube channel as their second job. But the thing is, my primary job needs all of my attention, so I don't really have the capability of turning my YouTube thing into something, you know, normal. Honestly, what keeps me motivated in creating YouTube content in general is my boredom or some sort of inspiration. I know that this is a bad trait to have, but I'm usually very sporadic when it comes to inspiration. So I have some sort of project, I start doing it, I meet it halfway, and then something else catches my attention, and I'm usually very quick to start a second, and then a third, and then a fourth project rather, and then just kind of think that I can switch between them whenever the mood strikes, because the mood change a lot. But what it usually happens is that one of these projects gets neglected to the point where it's just not worth investing into it or restarting it because I've completely lost my whole idea for it. And that's basically it. So what usually keeps me motivated, at least when it comes to content that I create for YouTube, is basically boredom. So I had the whole Rust thing, for example. I did not really get gripped by the game, so I basically stopped updating it, but it's still there. Same thing with Avorion, with the last Let's Play of Pepperoso. Technically, I could still, you know, continue it, and I still have the save, but now it's been such a long time between the uploads that perhaps it's not worth the investment anymore. So that's basically it. I would like to think that I do have some self-discipline in terms of if I start doing something, I do want to eventually finish it. But as we already saw with the Freelancer Let's Play, where I actually had to follow the suggestions of the comments stating that give us at least some sort of closure, just don't, you know, chop it off like you did with the previous year. I think that's not the case yet. Hopefully I will, develop that sort of professional attitude towards my projects, but right now, my overall life revolves around my job, so I don't have the time to consider what keeps me motivated. I either do my job, or I do something that is not my job, and so I don't feel obliged to invest in it as professionally, so that is my off time. So, yeah, that's basically it. The next question is about Avorion again. If you were asked to expand Avorion's endgame after the barrier, what would you suggest, or rather, what other challenges goals would you offer players who completed the game's final objective, trying to not to spoil anything for others? And that's a good thing that you're trying to not spoil anything for others, because I've honestly never actually beaten Avorion, because I always got bored of the grind. I never made past the barrier. I know what happens. I've seen videos, I've read the Wikipedia, so, you know, but to get there, I think the game becomes a little bit too repetitive in its current state, but that's the catch, isn't it? Avorion is still in process, and I think that it would actually be within the best intentions of the game's developers if, upon releasing 1.1, they released it with a completely redone story and objective. The barrier seems to be a artificial stepping stone to make sure that the player has ground X amount of in-game time to progress past a certain building block. So in our case, that would be defeating all the bosses, doing all these little missions. I already talked before how I think that some of these missions are a little bit arbitrary and actually very easy to miss, so I'm kind of hoping that they will notice this and kind of make adjustments to the overall progression of the game where the barrier just doesn't exist. If I was given a chance to change something with the current Avorion's in-game, it would be basically inverting the current progression in terms of how the galaxy is structured. So you start at the center with iron, and the further out into the unlawful areas you get, the more rare the minerals you find, but the more dangerous the things are. But the only problem here is that it would be very suited to a game with a lore and plot, but not as a cohesive single-player storyline progression. I think it would be a little bit more like, again, Mount & Blade Warband, where it's just a perpetual sandbox experience until you basically get bored or just, take everything over. But in order to do that, the game currently lacks a lot of the mechanics it needs to have, especially in terms of how the galaxy interacts not specifically with the player, but with itself. So how the factions treat one another, how the territory tends to change, and most importantly, the biggest stepping stone with the endgame content, I think, is trying to figure out how to make the engagements more varied and grandiose without having to resort to basically balancing the game in terms of how much damage you receive and how much hit points the advanced enemies have, because again, just buffing hit points is not going to be enough to make it engaging. I think it would have to include, kind of like Freelancer, obviously it's not really noticeable, even in vanilla Freelancer I didn't really notice that much, but each NPC level tend to have some sort of very different way they flew. They had this different sort of pattern, they would, sort of that thing. But it's kind of hard to do in Avorion because you don't have this drift, or the lack of drift. You don't have this on-rails experience like you have in Freelancer, where you just move the mouse cursor and it immediately makes the ship change its momentum. You still drift. You have momentum, you have ship mass and everything else. So I think that by using that sort of flight mechanic, you're giving up ways to balance your NPCs against the player in other ways apart from just using different kinds of weapons, having more armor, more shields, or something else. So I'm kind of interested to see how that goes. But overall, I think the endgame should be something that is perpetual and challenges the player, but I think it's going to be solved by mods in general, so I'm not really that worried about it for now. I want to see the game released with all the development tools necessary for people to create content, and after that, if the players feel like they are missing something from the vanilla game experience, they can just patch it in themselves, and I think that is, if they manage to do this correctly, that is going to make Avorion stand out above its contemporaries. And now we have the last question from Freelance Warzone regarding the possibility of future videos of a podcast nature. Well, the thing is, I'm not really sure how I feel about podcasts, because it usually requires at least two people who have a very varied and often conflicting experiences in whatever topic they choose to do. So, for example, I used to, for a while, listen to Hello Internet by CGP Grey, and the talk that they had, for me, was a little bit hit and miss. Some of them I really liked and I really enjoyed listening to, and it made me smile on many occasions as I just walked around with the podcast, and some of them I was completely disinterested in. So if we focus such a type of video to Freelancer, it would necessitate that it was a talk between two people of a completely, well, not completely, but at least at some point they have a kind of differing opinion on something. Otherwise it just ends up in as a hug box video where two vets with rose-tinted glasses just looking back, remembering things about Freelancer in a way that, well, it wasn't really that nice, Because, well, it has happened before. We had the Tau talk, we had the GRN talk, Meet the Faction, stuff like that. It is interesting until you start actually recording it, and then people quickly realize that to talk about the history of disco is to talk about moments of drama that was more interesting rather than damaging. But as you can see with the current state of Disco, it hasn't led, like these ongoing moments of drama, haven't really led to a healthy community. And I think that glorifying these sort of things in a podcast, they are fun to remember. I remember being a shitter, and I would really like to talk about it because it was really fun. Because back then you could be a rather, well, not toxic, but a very mischievous member of the community without hurting the community because it was still a very large community. Your shittery was added to a huge pot to which your actions almost didn't register. So it was interesting. But if you promote that sort of thing as a veteran player, you are damaging the future of Disco because people might get the wrong idea, or even worse, they might be encouraged to try something like that, and I don't think that this sort of shit would fly in the current Disco environment. So, I am skeptical on two fronts. One, I don't think that I'm going to find someone to do these videos with who has the same sort of experience in terms of how long they've been around. And, well, I would like to host it, like, for example, ask two members that are on the opposing spectrum to talk about their stuff and me just being as the mediator. That might be interesting. But as a regular podcast, I don't think that too many things happen in Disco so often for it to result in a podcast. But, again, I'm looking forward for it as a possibility, but until then I think I'll pass. Next question. How are you? Thanks. Doing fine. How about you? Okay, gents, and here we are at our home stretch. Both of these last questions submitted by Derpnoodle, and they go hand to hand pretty much. What do you think the algorithm is shitting on you despite you having hundreds of good videos? I enjoy them a lot, but you rarely get over 1,000 views. Much sad. I know I'm a day after the deadline, but there's a few comments. What are your thoughts about facecam videos? I know it doesn't add much, but it's nice to see a human on the other side of the screen. So, the thing about YouTube's algorithm and content creation in general, from what I've seen about the statistics of my own channel, is that people seem to watch repetitive things based on their tastes in the terms of gaming, for example. So you have people who have dedicated their channel to one specific game, so you have your examples like Quickie Baby, who only does, World of Tanks stuff. And, of course, you have the hundreds of Minecrafts and other settings. So, people like these sort of channels because, or rather, YouTube likes the sort of channels because they're much easier to put into people's suggestion box, because if they watch some sort of topic and that channel only does that one topic, it's easier to just add it as suggestions and make them, watch these videos. But at the same time, I got tired, so this whole channel grew up on Freelancer, pretty much, but as time went on, I kind of got tired of Freelancer, so I started doing, other things. So obviously, those don't really, resonate much with the current subscriber count, and neither does Freelancer as well anymore, because Freelancer is way past its prime at this point. So, I used to get more than 1,000 views, but it's just that it was on Freelancer, and it used to be during the time when Freelancer was still a thing. And as for facecam videos, now, many of you actually know how I look like in real life, because I did post in the real-life thread on the Disco forums, so my face is there a couple of times. But the thing is, I really don't think that my 30s slightly overweight mug is going to add to the fun of the video. But honestly, it's that if I wanted to make a video with facecam, I would need to prepare my gaming, my gaming surroundings to be presentable enough to be included in a video camera, or rather in a shot. And I'm too lazy for that. I play games, I sit at the PC to relax. I'm not going to make it look presentable. I have to sit in an office. I already do that. I play games to escape that. Also, that would require me to wear pants. That's not gonna happen. Anyway, thanks for the suggestions, thanks for the questions, guys, and I hope that, next time this might be a little bit more interesting for you. Anyway, this is Spazzy Dragon aka Syndromes. Time to sleep.